So just quickly to introduce myself, my name is Courtney Brown. I am the co-founder of the California Alliance for Community Composting. We are running a series of webinars from now until January 2025, which we're affectionately calling continued learning groups. These are topic-oriented sessions based on what you've asked from us, where you need additional technical assistance. These resources will be recorded. They will also be shared with the PowerPoint slides, which we will make available in English and Spanish, and can do any other language as requested. We'll also have some interactive sessions today using Whiteboard. So I'll go over how to do that again this week. And we will also have an opportunity to mix and mingle with each other and get some feedback on your ideas or examples of grant writing work that you've done already. So without further ado, I would like to take a moment to introduce our speaker today. We are joined by Lindsay Saperstone. She works with as a development associate with Colorado-based food justice organization, Sprout City Farms, and is a freelance grant writer, primarily in the food systems field. She has an MBA from Colorado State University with a focus on sustainability and social entrepreneurship, and she's worked for more than 10 years in the food systems in nonprofits, local government, and social businesses. So she can see all three ends of preparing a solid grant application. She's helped raise over $1 million for local public health agencies and community organizations in food systems and food access work, and $200,000 for community composters. So I'd like to give a really warm welcome to Lindsay today. She will be presenting on creating a grant application that allows you to scale your work from a small one-off project to larger programs. So Lindsay, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Everyone can hear me okay still? Nothing's changed. Okay, wonderful. Thank you. I'm happy to be here today. I'll go ahead and pull up my presentation. So yeah, I've been asked to do this presentation, grant writing, scale projects to programs. I have a lot of information here. Some of it is admittedly on the more boring, logistical, administrative end, but it's all really important when it comes to grant writing, to submitting grant applications. Some of my top slides are a bit text heavy, some of them aren't. I will be giving you a copy of the slides. I have a longer document, Google Docs, of everything that I'm going to say. So I encourage you not to try to feverishly take notes on what's on the slides or anything, because it's all going to be in front of you. I just sometimes can't think of another way to organize a slide other than to put some of the information there. And also so that you don't have to look back in the long document later if you only want to look back on the slides. But you will have both the slides, which is the shorter amount, and the document, which has a lot more detail, as well as everything has live links, both in the PowerPoint that I'll share and the document. So everything should be pretty easy to find. Oops, I used to moving this. Didn't put anything on here. Courtney gave me a nice introduction on what I've done professionally. And so yeah, just I have experience in food systems. I have a lot of experience in programs and building partnerships, which I know is going to be really important for some of these larger grant program or grant opportunities. And then yes, have been doing some consulting grant writing. And yeah, I'm really excited about this community composting group. The composting that I've raised money for have not necessarily been the type of really community-based compost. It's a social business. There's a lot of wonderful community pieces to it, but I've loved learning about what some of your organizations are doing that are even more unique than basically the compost collector and you'll see examples from. So this is what we're going to go over today. It's basically divided into two sections. Again, lots and lots of details. One is going to be all about finding grants and really finding appropriate grant opportunities. Once you find one, how do you know that it's really the right opportunity as well? And then we'll do a little bit more about the actual application, some of my process, focusing in on what a good narrative is and work plan, program management and collaboration, a lot of the attachments and kind of other pieces that go into it, talk about the budget and submission. So I started with the really, from the beginning, the types of different funders that to think about, especially with bigger grants, just the difference between a community foundation, which is usually a pooled source of funding from different individuals, families, businesses. I put some examples on there that you may have heard of, and then there's also a link to this really great resource of basically all California, well, I would say they're all, many California community foundations. A lot of these community foundations have a geographical focus. They do have priority areas, but they're often more broad. They mostly just want to see a social or environmental or positive impact in the community they serve. So these are really great places to look if they have any kind of environmental program at all, to start looking at the community foundations in your area, because they will want to invest in programs that make a difference local to them. Some of them are in one specific city, some have a county, they'll define their geography. Private foundations usually have one funder, one corporation, one large family, one individual, and they do have a pretty specific mission and goals about how they want to fund. And so you will have to look even more carefully at what their mission and priority areas are. And I also just wanted to note that some private foundations don't have open grants. They're called operating private foundations, and they decide internally where their money goes. But there is a whole set of private foundations that are designed to, they're called non-operating, and they're designed to support grant making. And those are the types of foundations that you will also want to look into. I put a couple of examples in my document, like Mitsubishi has an environmental grants program. Waste Management, the waste company, has a charitable contribution programs that are non-operating with grant making options. Then, of course, there are going to be larger grant opportunities from the government. From the federal level, they usually come from the different agencies. I put EPA and USDA as examples. And in the document that I'll share, the links actually link to their grants programs page, so you can get a sense of that. State agencies also offer grants. Cal Recycle is one of the funders of the grant that's operating this program right now. I put the California EPA and the California Department of Food and Agriculture. Again, they're all going to have their own grant programs. I did notice that, and then at the county level, you can start looking at some of your local county government pages. County health departments sometimes have specific grants in the environmental space that might be applicable for composting. Sometimes mayor's offices, offices of economic development, different commissions. Every community is going to be a little different, but it does get kind of confusing out there. But there are a lot of different organizations. I did notice, and I don't think I put the link into this PowerPoint, but I can share that in a little bit, that there's as of last year, there's a California grants portal, or what they're calling, I actually have that on another page as well, so I'll get to it. There's a resource to look within state government grants in California. Moving on. When searching for a grant, I sort of divided this into the high level and then more of the deeper dive. So again, looking geographically, go ahead and putting in California, or if you want to, or then be more specific, the city in California, and say Western United States, or Central California. And I wanted to use this slide to talk a little bit about the different types of grants. These are both search words, but also ways to think about your grant. A program and a project is probably going to be one of the most common grants that you all are looking for. Um, a program is a grant that's, a program grant supports specific projects that are tied for specific project-based outcomes. So you're trying to accomplish a certain amount of composting or engage a certain number of people in your project. And what are going to be, we'll talk about this in more detail a bit later, but you're going to be doing specific activities that bring you to that. Capital expenditures are generally larger things like buildings and larger equipment. I worked for a compost company that we fundraised for trucks before and cart tippers. And so we had to have a grant that allowed for equipment and equipment. Operations are grants that generally support any kind of operation. So you might have multiple programs or multiple projects that you're working on, and it can be spread out. Or operational can simply mean they don't really need the details. They're supporting you as an organization and whatever you need to operate. They're a little less common, but it's another way of searching for the grant. Capacity building is the strengthening an organization's systems, increasing its effectiveness. So this is like strategic planning, maybe diversity, equity, and inclusion training or programs. Some grants are designed to be for seeds or startups, and those might be helpful for some of the newer projects out there. Some funders don't fund to those at all, and some do. So if you are looking for startup funds, you can use that as a search word. And then I grabbed this from Jimena because she said that when she was originally searching, when she put in micro environmental grants, micro grants, she found some smaller options as well. You can also search for the type of organization that you are. Many of you are 501c3s. Other ways they use words in that are nonprofits, community-based organizations, public charity, and then if there's for-profits as well. We'll get more into organizations briefly when we talk about eligibility, but again, you can sort of do an example would be California program micro grant for a nonprofit, and you might start getting a list there. For a deeper dive, and I grabbed these specific questions from a free course on a resource called Grantly that I'll share as well. They probe you to look into the problem and issue that your organization, program, or project addresses, the type of services that they provide, who is the target audience, and what type of community does it operate in. And I went ahead on the next slide and just put in some words that I think are common, could be common answers to that. You might have different ones yourself. In the presentation with Jimena, she, I think, spent some time letting you think a little bit about your mission. And I think these have similar words. What do you do? What do you create? And so I'm not going to do an activity with that right now because I think it's kind of similar. But I shared some words that I've seen in the compost or community compost grant writing space that can also serve as search words as you're looking for grants. So I just climate change, greenhouse gas emissions, sustainable resource management, sustainable agriculture, regenerative agriculture, waste diversion, circular economy, zero waste, resource recovery. Those are all problems or issues that these organizations address. And the services they can do, of course, composting. Have composting on its own there, but community compost, compost education. Some funders still talk a lot about waste diversion or waste collection, waste, and then compost collection, compost distribution, food scraps. I thought I'd give a chance. Oh, and then you can think about who your target audience is, which is going to vary, but again, that might narrow down your searches as well. If anyone has any other, mostly services, I was thinking that they wanted to share in the chat, that would be helpful. I can give you a moment to do that. It's a little calling us back to last week, but what are some of the things that you want to provide? Right, I will read. Providing safe and healthy spaces for recreation, food access, healthier soils for growing food, and higher quality compost. I love these. Thank you. Oh, I missed a few. Oh no, we just get it. Education to the community, education hub for composting and soil regeneration knowledge, food access to all, and community garden space, resource recovery. Awesome. We'll kind of keep those all together. These can be a bank of words that you use in your searches as well as in your applications, but it's helpful to think about how to be clear of what you're looking for. Again, in just a moment. So these are some tools that I've thought about for this presentation, and there's kind of a lot. Unfortunately, there's no one free, wonderful database that has everything for searching for a grant. You're going to want to start with Google and search using geography and the type of grant and the type of entity. And then also using those deeper search word terms that we just came up with right now, we just talked about now. So Candid is one of the most, I'd say, established foundation resources, databases. It's not cheap. It can range anything from, I don't know, 55 to 200 and something a month. But I wanted to note that there's community partners that have Candid accounts, let you search for free. And so I included a link to their database. And by partners, I mean these are local libraries, sometimes they're nonprofits that have an account and let anyone look at them. So I highly recommend, if you have one in your community, going and doing grant research there. Grantly has a list of all of the different state resources. So that's where that list of community foundations that I mentioned earlier is located. And then they also do have a list of current grant opportunities in your state available. It's by no means complete. That's kind of what I want to say with all of this. I don't know how complete Candidate, I would guess it's fairly complete, but most of these aggregators, most of these search engines don't have everything. So it's kind of looking at a lot of different places. I am too busy. And yes, libraries are definitely where you're going to find candidates, so that's good to know. There is a Council on Foundations, has a community foundation locator. This website, grantmakers.io, aggregates a lot of organizations 990s, which I'll touch on in a moment. Again, it's not complete, but it is a place that you could find out where other organizations have been funded before or who foundations have given funds to and get an idea of potential other funders. Instrumental is another one that's pretty expensive, but I did notice that they have a free month trial and you don't have to give them any payment information. And so there was a time that I kind of mined some ideas from that resource. Grant Gopher, Grant Watch, Grant Finder, Grant Station, Grantscape are all different ones that are also paid services. I haven't tried all of them other than Grant Gopher has a free version and I have gotten some ideas from that. And I also really recommend joining listservs of organizations that are relevant or that are in your field. Organizations that, I mean, like CAC would be a good example. I'm sure many of you are on the listserv, and that's how we found out about these workshops. But the Institute for Local Self-Reliance or the EPA or any other groups are just really great ways to find out about grant opportunities. For federal opportunities, everything can be found at grants.gov. And in a moment, we'll take a look at that portal. And then this is the portal that I brought up before, which is a newer one, grants.ca.gov, to be able to look for statewide grants. I'll admit that just by putting in compost and even then looking more broadly at the environmental grants available right now, I didn't see anything too exciting to use as an example today, but I would mark that page and search for it, because as other opportunities come up, that would be a great resource. All right, I'm going to check out the chat for a moment. Yes, everything will be available. All of the links will be available in the slides and in a Google Doc. Now, sometimes you want to know who a foundation has given to in the past, and you go to their website and you can't find anything. Some foundations will be wonderful and they will say, these are everyone we've ever donated to. These are the different categories. This is how big it was. And that is so helpful for planning. And I encourage you to, if you find a foundation that has, environmental grants or grants that look good, to see if you can find that. If you can't, and then you can't find more about that information on maybe Grant Makers or one of these other organizations that compiles 990 data, you can take a peek you can look for the 990 of the organization. So the 990 is the tax return that all nonprofits must file. There's different versions, and like the 990 PF is for private foundations, whereas most of the ones you'd be looking at are the regular 990. I think the EZ or the N are for quite small organizations. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but this is a snapshot from the Silicon Valley Foundation, who did not have one of those nice lists of grantees on their websites, but they did post their 990s. And I scrolled down, this is all the way in page 55. There started this multi-page attachment where they list every single grant that they've given to. It would be in the previous year. So if they filed this in 2022, of course, or if this is the 2022 return, it would be the whole year prior. And it's also the ones that were only issued that year, not ones that were maybe promised but then actually expended the next year. So there's some limitations, but ultimately it's a way you can see how much money they gave to an organization and what was the category. So I just wanted to say that that's sort of your one more way that you can search for funders, because you can see where else they've been giving money to, what other organizations are similar. And it's also really helpful, I think, to know what the amounts are. Some funders don't tell you what their range is per se, so you want to ask for amount that it just helps you get an idea of what would be a good amount to ask for. Any questions up until this point? Yes, 990s are public. And I might let someone like Courtney chime in a moment if I'm not getting this exactly right. There's not like I think they're supposed to put them on their website or make them public. There's a lot of websites that aggregate them, but I usually am Googling them and trying to see where the best link is. Courtney, do you have a better answer of a way you're supposed to get a hold of a 990?
Charity Navigator is a website that folks can search if they're looking to donate to an organization to see if they're a good charity or a nonprofit. And all those nonprofits have to put up their 990s. I mean, all of that is public information. I think Charity Navigator organizes it. So when I've been searching other groups that are very similar to us to see who funds them, I would go to Charity Navigator and look at my peers and see who's supporting them. Ours is public information, but we don't do any work in posting that ourselves, so I'm not sure how it's getting up there. but they're very findable. And once you know the order of a 990, it's really easy to search them to just go to that same page or that same section for most organizations.
Thanks, Courtney. Okay. I wanted to share some vocabulary that comes up in a lot of these searches. Did I leave this around in my notes? Put this first. So, notice of funding availability, no fuzz, or notice of, yes, or funding opportunity announcements are common. These are usually with federal, usually for government entities. It's the agency's plan that they're going to announce an award, and they usually try to give you a little bit more time with these proposals since they're so complex. An RFA is a request for an application, and it's an official request for applications. It usually outlines eligibility and the amount of funding available, the timing, and etc. An RFP is usually a request for proposal, is an invitation from a funder to submit applications on a very specific topic with a very specific purpose. They're not as common, but they are pretty common for new projects, new programs, possibly seed programs. So they're, especially if you're doing something kind of innovative, you're going to see RFPs. An example that I'm going to talk about a bit later is the use of them in the Jobs First Catalyst funding. They are putting out some regional groups are starting to put out their RFPs for that amount of money. A letter of inquiry, or an LOI, is kind of like a pre-application or a screening letter that some funders request before they invite you to apply for a whole application. It's kind of a positive because you do a bit less work and you get to share some of your main points about why you're qualified, what you would be interested. They're usually only about 1 to 2 pages. And then you don't have to go through the entire complex application if the funder really doesn't think you're in the right, in the right category. So the application for an LOI is usually due a few months prior to the application. So if you see an LOI due date, that means that that's what you need to be preparing before you prepare a full application. An SOW, a statement of work, or a scope of work, or a summary of work is sometimes required as part of an application. It's usually a part of the project description and explains why this project is necessary, why this project is going to be a solution to what's needed. And it usually has a detail of how the program will carry out. We'll also talk about work plans. Those are often part of it too. An MOU is a memorandum of understanding, which is a non-binding written agreement that outlines each partner or collaborator contributes. Funders like to see MOUs as part of the grant making process because it demonstrates you're not replicating something and you're kind of complementing other services available. Some funders request letters of support, which we talked about briefly last week as well, which are also which are similar. I mean, they're not necessarily the written agreement, but they are a partner vouching for another partner and also saying that there is a complement, they're complementing work that's being done in the same area. These are sometimes attachments that you would include. Okay, costs. Direct costs are essentially program costs. Whatever, they have a specific connection to the program or activity of the organizations. Some organizations have one program, some have many. Overhead or indirect costs are kind of everything else. On a 990, they're divided into the general categories of management and general costs and fundraising costs. Fundraising costs being what you pay someone to write grants or do any fundraising. And management in general can range anything from utilities, administrative salaries, etc. They matter, and we'll talk about that briefly because some funders like have limits on these type of costs, but getting ahead of myself. In-kind contributions or non-monetary contributions, so work or other contributions that are not money. Sometimes you have to note those on an application. The federal fiscal year, that's pretty straightforward, and BOD being the board of directors. See, I lose the chat. Okay, wonderful. Oh, I forget how I'm doing this. Okay, eligibility of the requirements. There are several, but in this first slide, I just want to talk about the eligibility when it comes to the type of organization. On the screen, you see a snapshot from Cal Recycle for the CCGS grant. And you can see all of the different eligible applicants listed out pretty specifically. So it says local government, and then it even goes into, we're talking about cities, counties, regional agencies, waste agencies, special district, nonprofits, but except for private schools. And so it's just really important that for any grant opportunity, you carefully read the eligible applicants. You know what kind of entity you are, and you take a good look to make sure, take a look and see if you're eligible. I was thinking here we could do a pretty quick activity. And this is how it will work. So I'm gonna stop sharing for a second. So this is grants.gov. This is where you're going to be looking for federal grant opportunities. It doesn't automatically take you to a search, but you can see there's a search right here. And I was thinking that if everyone wanted to take a moment and open this, and in the keyword section, type in compost. And you will notice that there's an opportunity that comes up at the top. And it's a newer opportunity posted by the USDA. Some of you may know the answer to this, some of you not. But I was hoping everyone could open the opportunity. And I'm going to do that real quick. I'll show you what it's going to look like. But then I'm going to stop. I'm going to stop sharing for a moment. And I want you to take a look at that page and see if you can find the eligible applicants. And basically, in the chat, put yes or no if your project would be eligible to apply for that opportunity. You typed in compost. And yes, there are 7 different things that come up. Briefly scrolling through, you can see some of them are in specific states. So that's not going to apply. Even just by the title, solid waste infrastructure grants, unclear. The one at the very bottom, I will bring up later, the environmental justice and community change grants. And then this was his brownfields job training. So the only one that looked kind of, I don't know, it maybe for a moment be like, ooh, composting and food waste reduction, that's what we do. And you click on it. And yes, everyone correctly noted that as a standalone project, they would not be eligible because this is designed for local government, essentially. There needs to be a lead on local government, although they can certainly partner with local organizations and are encouraged to. So yeah, thank you for doing that. Check out the chat. Ooh, sorry. Awesome. Okay, so that was my tiny activity there. Thank you for. Okay, so that's eligibility requirements, which is one part of eligibility, or that is organization eligibility requirements. However, aside from organization, there are some other eligibility requirements that sometimes are really obvious, or that sometimes you find out when you find a grant. So one being geography. This, of course, comes across in a lot of community foundation grants. They have very specific either states or counties or cities that they're working in. Sometimes there's a target community served. Sometimes it's designed to affect youth or older adults or low income, which and grants and funders will, I think it's worth noting here and maybe a couple times throughout, funders are going to often have different definitions for disadvantaged. There's the EPA has a very specific way of talking about the communities when they're talking about environmental justice and the communities that have been historically and actually and presently disadvantaged, who they mean, and they use maps to determine that. And other funders have slightly different criteria, or they end up being some of the same communities, but they're using different tools. But ultimately, you want to, depending on what the funder is requesting, ensure that you are working in a community that is eligible. Uses there are some really common restrictions for uses of funds for grants. Some of the most common being lobbying and political activities, capital expenditures. As I mentioned before, not everyone wants to fund a big building project, but some are specifically designed for that. But a lot of times they'll say no capital expenditures. Research is sometimes limited or is often limited. Sometimes new projects are limited. So if you do have a brand new project, just that's not your funder, move on, and that's okay. I've seen funders write event sponsorship or fundraising events are restricted, even though some foundations have special funds just for sponsorship and events. And their grant opportunities will not be for that. I've also seen written on websites, you cannot use this to fill budget shortfalls or funding gaps due to emergencies or the executive director leaving unexpectedly. Sometimes they'll be very specific. Revenue limits. So sometimes there's a limit as to how much revenue your organization can take in to be qualified for this grant. And similarly, the size of your budget. So I've seen funders that say we're looking to fund organizations that are in the small to mid 6 digits, or you must have an operating budget of $1 million or more, or be smaller than $50,000, for example, for a startup project. If they allow fiscal sponsors is going to be an eligibility requirement, and I will touch on fiscal sponsorships in just a moment. But that's going to be, if you do use a fiscal sponsor, you will need to know if you are eligible to do that. I grabbed this one example just to show you the way they wrote it out on one more page. So I will grab that. This is a foundation that does have an environmental grants program and is focused a lot on environmental justice, called the Roy A. Hunt Foundation. And I was just going to show you the way they wrote out some of their eligibility on their website. Well, first of all, they do require an LOI. So for those of you who are new to that, I went past it. But yeah, they sort of wrote it out. The committee will not consider capital projects and easements, local watersheds, conservancies, and land trusts, and grants that directly affect specific legislative decisions. So the moral of the story is read your eligibility before you get too far along. What else? We'll talk about fiscal sponsors, and then I'll go back to the other one, because I mentioned that before. So fiscal sponsorship is an arrangement between your charitable project, the project that you're doing, and an established 501c3 to help collect and distribute, manage funds, provide administrative support. I also wanted to note the concept of a fiscal lead, which is sometimes in a collaborative grant. there is one organization that will take primary responsibility for the fiscal management of the grant. And they're different. They're not a sponsor, but I wanted to note that. Fiscal sponsorship is often used for small organizations before they get 501c3 status. It can also be used for individuals or collectives that are not necessarily planning to establish, but need that administrative support. There are LLCs with charitable projects, can get us fiscal sponsorship, or 501c3s that want to reduce their administrative burden. And there are many, many models to this. I don't even know if I know all of them, but I do know that the two main common ones when it comes to grant making for nonprofits are what they call Model C and Model A. And I actually took an image from a social impact commons, whereas one of them is more of a grant making relationship or a pre-approved grant making relationship. So basically your project is pretty autonomous. The sponsor gets the grant, but they distribute it back out to you. You do you pay the contractors, you do all the you basically do most of the work, but because you don't have your 501c3 or because, I don't know, whatever reason, administratively, it's easier to be kind of a pass-through entity to work through another organization. It's a little bit more at a hand's length from your sponsor. And I've been in this type of relationship before. I've been a brand new project and I did all my bookkeeping. I shared it. I used the budget forms that they gave, or I used the budget templates that they gave me to keep track of everything. They paid us and we spent the money and then reported back to them. And it was basically a way for us to receive a large grant without being an established 501c3 yet. And then the other model is a little bit more, it's called a comprehensive fiscal sponsorship. And basically the project becomes part of the sponsor. So they do pretty much everything. And your nonprofit for that time is sort of part of that organization for the relationship of the grant. I have a feeling Courtney, who has, CAC was fiscally sponsored twice to access grants when they were growing.
These were Model C.
With Model C, yes.
And then we fiscally sponsor one group to work with us to carry out CCGS in the Inland Empire region. So we have a Model A agreement with Desert Compost.
Yay, I love that you have real examples. Perfect. Okay, so that's fiscal sponsorship and fiscal leads. My last, well, I don't know if it's one of the last ones in this section is really what else to consider when you're looking for a grant, because there is so much more. So award size, sometimes it's a range. Think about if that's an appropriate amount that if it's too high, can you use it? If it's too small, is it worth your time? You can look at the past average size. Sometimes they post the average sizes. Sometimes they will have a list of past awards, as I mentioned. 990s are also a good place to get a sense of the types of sizes that funders are offering. Basically, some funders are advertising this is what you're allowed to ask for, and some of them don't say anything. So you kind of have to figure out what would be an appropriate amount. You can look at past grantees, and this is to get a sense of similar priority areas, similar types of projects, and to get a sense of what this organization is investing in. Their priority funding area is really important. And I kind of want to hark back to, I thought Jimena did a really good job talking about gathering keywords, gathering priority areas, really looking at what they are interested in funding and being really clear that your program fits within that. Similarly, you want to look at the target community. Maybe it's not an eligibility requirement, but maybe they have a preference. I was working on a grant the other day that just said we're going to most strongly consider or the grants that we are most likely to invest in are the ones that address the root causes of poverty. It was broad, but they were telling you, yes, our categories are human services and human services and education, but they were telling you, talk about it as the root causes of poverty. Timeline in grant cycle. This is really important. There will be a date usually that the application opens and a date that it closes. So this is sometimes it's open year round, or it's a little bit of a longer process and you can kind of just drop in whenever you want, but oftentimes it will be open for a certain number of weeks or months, depending on how cumbersome the grant is. And then it will close at a specific time, and that is your deadline. And I would even check the time. I recently did one that closed at like 11 a.m. or something. It was so I made sure to apply at least the day before. Check when they will notify the applicants, and check when the funds will be dispersed, because there are sometimes two different dates as well. Does that fit with what you're planning? If you're expecting this money really quickly, you need to check in and see when all of that's happening. Also look to see what's the cycle of the grant. Most grants are about a year, some are multi-year, but what does that mean for your program? Is it something you can complete in a year? Is this something that you would need to reapply for more funding to complete? So look at the cycle. And I would even say look at the reporting requirements, which are usually collected with the cycle, just to get a sense of how much of an administrative burden the grant is. And it will also help you with planning your budget as well. Some grants have a lot of reporting requirements, and you need to make sure that you have people to do that. I don't think you should not necessarily not apply for grants because of reporting requirements, but it's something to look in with the whole cycle. Then I want you to look at how you apply. Most applications now use online portals, and so making an account is kind of one of your first steps. I've noticed that some lately it takes a few days to confirm, so give yourself that time as well. I think sometimes it's like 48 hours to confirm your organization before you can use their portal. Perhaps the most important thing, can you see the application ahead of time? If you can't, if there's no PDF or the questions are written out, this is when you can request a PDF from one of the officers. You can ask hey, can I see the questions? Some might have a portal and actually require you to start filling it out in order to see the answers. And I've actually gone as far as to make up answers at times just to get to the end of the portal. And then I can see all the questions and I copy and paste them into a document. It's not ideal, but you really want to know everything that goes into the application before you start. In that sense, you're also going to look at the word counts and characters and pages. Again, this may not deter you from doing it, but consider it. Take a look. Is this a really long application? Is this a short application? And then what kind of attachments are they going to require? We will talk about budget in detail later, but the budget is usually its own attachment, its own section. How detailed is it going to be? Is there going to be a budget narrative? Are they going to want a key list of staff, board of directors, your IRS determination letter, your W-9, any other financial statements? Are you going to need letters of support or memorandums of understandings? Get a sense of all of that ahead of time. Moving on to, I wrote reimbursement grants. Some grants function on reimbursement, meaning you have to outlay the money ahead of time and they will reimburse you either when it's all over or after certain invoice periods. These are challenging for small organizations, of course. And I know that with CAC, it's one of the reasons sometimes they were able to enter into partnerships. I don't know, again, Courtney wants to speak to that a little bit, but it's basically quite a bit of a burden sometimes to have to lay on the funds ahead of time. You want to look and see if there's a cost sharing or match requirements, meaning do you have to either fundraise from elsewhere or spend money from your budget on the same program to be considered a match. Sometimes matches can be in kind. So if you don't actually have additional funding, is the labor that you, is there volunteer time for that? I'll show you some examples of the way I've used match requirements in a budget before. These are, yeah, you want to know this ahead of time. Look at the selection and evaluation criteria. How is the funder going to be evaluating this project? And I do have an example for that in a little bit too. And finally, watch the webinars, read the frequently asked questions, look for any contact information. It's always encouraged to contact funders and ask them how your project fits and to get any other information, including a copy of the application if you need it. Okay, that was a lot on that slide. I don't know if we have any questions. Okay. All right. I am going to move into this next portion, which is more about getting started on writing. So again, I'm going back to Jimena's language from last week, where she said, gather your keywords and priorities from the funder into one document. Having sort of a vocabulary bank or some suggestions of how you're going to frame your application is really helpful to get started. Then copy and paste all of the application questions into one document. Include all of the instructions. I include word count, page limits as well. And again, note all of the attachments that's going to be required. Finally, figure out if you have text already written. Jimena suggested that you basically start by creating some boilerplate text, some text about its program description, key staff, a little bit about what your impact, what you're trying to achieve. I meant to actually include one of those, that first slide in here, but I don't have it available at the moment. But having that on hand, kind of figure out what in that can already go into the text. And then as you write more, you're also going to be able to pull from past grant applications and also any other written material about your project. Maybe even have a really nice email that you wrote to a community partner that does a really good job explaining pieces of it. And I just think it's really helpful to get a sense of what you've written. Doesn't mean you'd be able to copy and paste everything and that's it, but it makes it feel less overwhelming when you realize you have some of this thought out yet, if you have. I want to show you some examples of how I've set up some of these working documents. So I'm going to stop and share. And we'll start with a narrative that I'm going to be sharing a couple of times throughout the rest of this presentation, which is a grant for a compost organization called Wompost in Colorado. They are considered themselves to be a social enterprise. They do not do community composting. In fact, they generally bring the compost to a large composter at the moment. But they are the only compost collection opportunity in a couple of cities in the Denver metro area. In some cities that don't have municipal composting, and they really make an effort to do community education, to teach people how to do their own compost as well. They do composting in schools, and then their main service is collecting compost and taking it to the site, to the composter, and then picking it up and delivering compost to community gardens and to individual gardens. Let's try to open this again. Okay, so this is a grant narrative that I used for Wompost. And what I wanted to show you, it's not that incredible, but it's very helpful, is I went ahead and posted each question and their instructions and the word count. And then I just keep track of the word count as I go. I even sometimes when I'm over, we'll make this red so I can know to go back and edit it down. But for example, the project description and purpose section, which is kind of the main narrative, which I will go over in more detail in just a moment, has a lot of sub questions, but I posted all of it here so I could see it in front, and then I use this document to work it. So the first thing I want you to do is to take all of the questions and put those descriptions in there. That was all I was really trying to show you with that. Another example of that is, let's see. There's this community, EPA has these, I was going to show you how in the community change grants, they have a very, very long application and a lot of details to it. But at one point, they gave me the font and the margins and some details about how to set it up. And I went ahead and just changed my whole draft document to those standards before I got started, so that everything that's written under it can start to become part of a real document. And all of this I would love to give you as a resource anyway. If you are looking at maybe collaborating on that grant, I've taken some notes on some of the key words and put at least part of the application into a document. It's not complete because it's a very, very long application, and I think it probably would depend on what part of the application that you're. So that's the getting started part. Let's see if I can go back to the actual workshop. Okay. So the program narrative. The program narrative is the chance it's to tell your story. It's to convey the significance and the impact of your program. It should include a lot of clear details. And this is the chance to convey to your funder why this is important. What are all the details of the project? It's often a collection of questions that the funder is asking you that's called the program narrative. Every once in a while, there'll be something a little bit more vague, and you'll kind of have to know what would make up a narrative. But more and more, the funder will ask you, it's kind of the part of the application that has the most written part to it, even if they are addressing specific questions in the way that they want to. They do ask them in a specific order for a reason, so they are, they are trying to, for their needs. But generally, the narrative is going to include information about your organization and background, project program description and details, the significance or impact, why is this important, your goals, objective, expected outcomes, and timeline. So I decided to share basically the first two paragraphs of a program narrative for WAPost. Let's see if I'm going to stop for just one moment and just read to you one thing really quick. Let's see. This question, it was the question said, provide a detailed explanation of how your project will contribute to the front range waste diversion goals, addressing each of the points below. So they actually gave me 6 different things to consider in answering this question, which is a lot. So I kind of just went one by one. But to start out, I'm just saying what's happening, what's the problem, what we're going to do, and that's what's on this first slide. So Courtney had suggested that I definitely give some examples for you. I will share this information in a longer form so you can read it better, but if you want to take a moment to read right now. here's a line. We talked a lot about like what we do. So this first line, Wampost, I can't highlight. Wampost is a social enterprise that provides organic waste collection services and compost education in these areas. Well, I had noted that those areas don't have those services, but that's what they do. So that's sort of a very direct, this is what we do. What kind of makes us unique or important? Wampost is the only hauler offering compost collection to Aurora's 380 residents and neighboring communities. So that sort of breaks apart the why is this important. There's some more details then below that. We say how much Wampost customers pay, how big they're paying $29 a month for a $5 bucket at this point in compostable bags, and how the compost collection is working. Below, then we give some numbers as to impact. Since we started compost collection in January 9, 2019, Wampost has diverted approximately 102,000 pounds of waste, or 51 tons from the landfill. The focus of this project, this is what we say, this is what we're going to do. The focus of this project is to add collection and hauling capacity and improve our existing work. Our goal is to expand our capacity for waste collection and community-based social marketing. So this is, again, we're being very specific. This is what we want to do. Then we go, and our objective is to increase the amount of organic waste composted and expand outreach to culturally relevant programming in schools, farmers markets, and community events. So this is sort of the outline. There's nothing, it's very direct, it's very specific. And this is kind of how we get started. Not the most exciting reading, but it's to the point. So this is how the program narrative started. Now, most program narratives also include a work plan. So this is where you're actually going to build a project timeline. You're going to break things down into the different tasks and activities. This is where you get to really think critically about all of the moving parts. What are the actual tiny to big to small, all of the different activities, all of the different things that have to happen in order for you to reach one of those outcomes? What do we have to do to compost, to divert more waste and do more community outreach, essentially, in our case, or in yours? And we'll do an activity in just a moment, and you get to think about this too. The purpose of this work plan, which is sometimes both in a chart as well as in a written narrative form, and I have examples of both, is to tie your goals, which are your broad overall, this is what you want to see come out of this, and your objectives, which are a little bit more specific, to the activities. A lot of funders use the idea of SMART objectives, which they define as specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. So this is a way of thinking about each objective. Your objective is to compost more or to divert more waste. How much? And is this amount achievable? And is it relevant because you're doing it at your community compost site versus you're trying to start a brand new project with a tiny amount of money? That's maybe the relevance and the achievableness of it. And in what amount of time? I also recently wrote a grant where a funder suggested we use a slightly different tool, which I included because I thought it was kind of cool. She had called it Smarty Goals, which was the same, although they used ambitious for achievable. I think both are probably helpful. You want to be both achievable and ambitious. And then they also included the inclusive and equitable parts to it. A lot of funders do ask you specifically about equity of your program. There are specific questions, but if not, it's also an opportunity to think about that directly when you're talking about your goals. So here's an example from what we did next in the Wampost application. So there was actually a work plan document where our overarching goal was to increase the capacity for waste collection and community-based social marketing. An objective So that was a little bit more detailed, which is to increase the amount of organic waste composted, because we don't just and expand. Well, I guess these are a little bit more detailed. Expand culturally relevant programming in the schools, farmers markets, and community events. And our first activity to do that would be expand waste collection services. But even breaking that down further, what does that mean? We purchased a new truck, cart tipper, and wheelie bins. We then distribute the wheelie bins or the yard waste bins to the customers and communicate with them about what goes in them, educate customers about composting, what actually goes into the yard waste bins. And then to increase the amount of people that are participating in our program, we also distribute scholarships to potential customers who cannot afford the service. There is an example of kind of point by point part of a work plan. However, we also had to write this into the narrative. So the same information is now written out into this narrative. So this is where I began activity by activity to explain what we're going to do. The first activity to achieve our goal is to expand services. We need to purchase a truck with larger hauling capacity and a cart tipper. Right now, we limit our customers to a 5-gallon bucket and one 30-gallon compostable bag. And we set these limits because we have to lift everything by hand and fit it into the pickup truck. So we tell them exactly why why we're doing our program the way we were, and what about this funding would allow it to be different. Our customers have asked for larger bins. And with a cart tipper, the staff was actually able to, as they projected, collect about 3 times more waste per household. It also would protect drivers from repetitive stress injury. And so, yeah, there's details about the program. And at the end, that would be an immediate 65% increase in the amount of waste Wampert diverse each week. And that was the first one. So I am going to share with you the entire narrative as well as the longer work plan. But these are kind of 2 different ways to think about the work plan part of the narrative. So I'd like to do an activity. Basically, what we're going to do is I want you to think about, I think using this would be the best slide to have up there. I want you to think about a SMART objective. I want you to think of a goal. I want you to think of a goal, a maybe more detailed SMART objective, and one activity that you have to do to achieve that goal that can go into your project narrative and your work plan. And we're going to be doing this using the whiteboard, and Courtney's going to take over with that because my whiteboard isn't working very well.
As we learned last week, this is a learning curve for folks. So just go ahead and add your Post-it notes. And if you're struggling with putting a box or put text, I'm just going to be working on cleaning it up as you are adding your sticky notes. So feel free to make mistakes and just practice with this. This is a learning experience and a virtual tool of being able to do an activity like this in person, where folks would be able to go up and write on a actual whiteboard. So you've got 2 options to do that. Again, over in the left-hand menu, you've got sticky notes. You can also start a text box, but the sticky notes are easier to see. With my view, I can hone in on a specific sticky note, zoom in on it, and we can read and go around. Okay, so I'm going to allow for not all eyes to be on me.
All right, so we're getting some goals coming in. A goal to have salary and fair wage for green jobs, increase soil biodiversity and water retention, funding for adult educational programming, increase pounds of food material composted, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and education programming to assist cities in implementing programs about organic waste recycling and helping them accomplish the pitfalls in statewide implementation. Awesome.
I'll just go around and look at some of these. We talked about them earlier for the seed funding versus operational capacity building, overhead, salaries for fair jobs and wages. We've got funding for adult education, and also really good objective here is the partnerships and network building that I saw in there. That was something that we haven't covered yet. So thank you who ever added that one. And then maybe we can just give it 5 minutes. If anyone has any questions that they would like to ask Lindsay from the first part of this presentation before we go ahead and take a break. So you can either feel free to raise your hand using the reactions and raising your hand there, or you can popcorn out into the chat.
All right. Well, I hope you had a nice break and a chance to go into the breakout room if you wanted. I think I'm gonna go back to share. I'm not sure if Susan if you got your question answered. Unfortunately, I couldn't see the whiteboard. I wasn't sure exactly whose was whose, but I'll lean on saying that it's okay for the objectives to be specific, and the examples that I saw were good. Okay, perfect. Courtney answered it. Okay. What I sort of wanted to help get out, or wanted you to potentially get out of that activity, was to be thinking of, yes, you have these. Well, I guess I'm not sure if people put in activities or not, so I'm going to just say that the idea was to kind of think about the next step, which is, let me go to my example here. So if you were going to start assisting cities in implementing programs, for the activities, it's even more specific of you need to, let's see, perhaps you have to create a guide for them on how to better implement these policies, or schedule times to meet with certain staff, kind of down to the activity level, step by step. How are you going to achieve that objective? And I'm not going to go back to that now. And if you did do some of those right now, awesome. So I apologize if it's repetitive, but overall, that's what I want you to be thinking about moving forward. And I thought I'd share with you, I had given you this example, but I thought I'd really quick share with you the whole thing before we move on to the next section, which really only has one more part to it. So once again, this is the work plan, and I had shown you one of them, which is if our main objective is if our overall objective is expanding compost or waste composted and expanding outreach. When you break it down into activities for expanded waste collection, we actually had to purchase the truck with bigger capacity, a cart tipper, and the yard waste bins, and we had to distribute those to customers. And then when it came to doing more compost outreach and education, some of the specifics of those activities were going to farmers markets and in community events, providing compost infrastructure, or essentially providing bins for the compost, and as well as signage, and developing and utilizing a culturally and locally relevant curriculum. Plus, every year Wampos manages an annual leaf drop, and so it was organizing and managing that. So just thinking about for the work plan, you're going to want to get into the kind of step-by-step details. Funders really like to know that you've really thought it through. And that's sort of what I wanted to convey with that one. So now we can go on to the next section. Or let me see if there's any other. Okay. So now evaluation criteria is, as it kind of sounds like, what is the funder looking for? Sometimes the funder will be fairly vague and basically say they won't provide like a rubric. It's basically based on their priority areas. Foundations that are a little bit more like family foundations might not have like a very set rubric, but government funders specifically will usually have a pretty set kind of rating, like a point system or a score they'll be used. And so you'll want to take a look at that before you to apply to see how your plan might fit into that. I went ahead and grabbed an example from an interesting one right here. This is going to be another one of those slightly boring texty slides. So the jobs, and I'm going to talk about more of this in just a moment, but the Jobs First program is at its phase of what they're calling catalyst funding. And catalyst funding is a smaller amount of money that is going, that has gone out to different regional collectives that is going to then be re-granted or redistributed to smaller projects. It's sort of the only amount of pot of money that might make its way somewhat into community composting from the large Jobs First program, which I think I have another slide. Maybe I could come back to that. Anyway, what I wanted to note about this before I tell you more about the Jobs First or about the Catalyst grants in general, is that they've actually posted from a state level some criteria that they want to use to be able to judge different proposals. The regions then are allowed to use those criteria or edit them down further. So they could actually make the criteria a little bit more narrow, but not more broad if they wanted to. Because the state has sort of determined these are the ways we're going to be looking at these, we're going to be evaluating these proposals. This is a draft from an RFP from one of the regions that will be putting out a proposal soon. And what I mostly wanted to note about this is that the way they've broken down the different score areas into categories, so they've broken it down by equity, climate, and job quality and access. That's fairly similar, but not exactly similar to the buckets that Jimena talked about last week. When you think about community composting, there's a piece of it that has equity, there's like an equity component to it, there's a climate component to it, and then I believe we looked at education, whereas because this is a job creation program, they are going to be assessing it on the job quality and access of jobs created. So these are the type of rubrics that you're going to want to look for from the funder and to try to get a sense of what's available. This one is, again, very detailed and heavy from the state, but that was sort of the one thing to also point out too. I had talked about communities or different funders define disadvantaged communities differently. The very first equity criteria on this one says that at least 40% of the funds provide direct and meaningful and assured benefits to disinvested communities. And they give you a map. They give you the Justice 40 ICARP, the AC tool. I don't know how different that is from the EPA's tool, but that would be the tool you use to go see if your community is located within that. So these are all helpful things to look at. I think, yeah, we'll talk about this and then I will talk more about the Jobs First Catalyst funds. So as you're preparing your application and including sometimes part of the narrative, the funder is going to want to know about your team, your credentials, what makes you uniquely qualified to execute this. They might want to know what roles different people are going to serve. For the work plan, they might want to know who's in charge of specific activities, who's going to draft the curriculum that's going to be used for teaching kids about community compost. How will they be compensated for doing that? Sometimes this is part of the narrative, as in it's written text that's kind of saying, it's sort of a way of selling yourself as not only like with your program description, you're setting out your side what makes you unique and special and the best qualified organization to do this type of work, how you're positioned based on what you do. And part of that is who you are. So it's just really important that you think about your team and the people running the program as one of your selling points, as what's part of the proposal. Some funders ask for just like a list of key staff with bios and credentials. This is a document you can certainly prepare ahead of time and have in sort of your boilerplate folder, and you can attach it when they ask for it. Remember, sometimes they ask for the list of your board of directors as well, which can be similar, but it's not really the same. The board certainly might be interesting to people, but it's not really the same as who's executing the work. That's a little bit about program management. The next category that I want to talk a little bit is about collaboration. And did I do this? There we go. Start with this one. So program collaborations and partnerships is just a really, really big part of large funding opportunities, especially from state and federal agencies. And getting ready to compete for these grants actually takes a really long time. It's not something that you're going to see the funding opportunity and really be able to just apply if you've not really done a lot of the groundwork. Sometimes groundwork, I mean, it is intentional, but it's also the result of doing really good community-based work. I say that is so that it's not trying to, there might be things that you should be doing that you aren't, but also it's to say that I trust that it is what you're, an organization as it grows, as it makes connections, as it builds relationships, is doing the groundwork to eventually prepare itself to go to scale. I mean, by default, that is what you're working on. So there are some specific things you can do early on, such as talking to local public officials and, you know, trying to make new relationships. But ultimately, as collaborative grants usually have a lead. Sometimes it's a co-lead, but they usually require at least a partnership between two or more entities. And those are pretty explicit in these big collaborative grants. And we've talked a little bit about MOUs and letters of support. So those are supporting documents you will use, including scope of work or work plans that include all of the partner organizations that will establish what this partnership will look like. And those are going to be really important documents to prepare for these collaborative grants. Some grants use subcontracting, meaning the grant goes through one entity and then the grant is subcontract out to different partners. There's a lot of different, sometimes it's the use, we've talked a little bit about the fiscal lead. So someone who has the bigger administrative capacity is taking on the larger part of it. Sometimes it's because the lead needs to be a certain entity. And for example, the USDA opportunity that we looked at recently, if you were to have a partnership with a local municipality that absolutely wanted to use some of that money for your community compost project, they would have to be the lead applicant, but would plan on subcontracting. But you make those arrangements, you make those MOUs, you make those work plans together ahead of time. All of this requires a lot of coordination. One of the last regional collaborative grants that I was on, we ended up creating kind of our own team system just for that grant, meaning, you know, kind of like a charter or set of norms for that group together. we had to divide up a lot of the reporting roles and be in constant communication, because a lot of meetings and a lot of coordination. But it is really fruitful because ultimately, I mean, larger organizations are giving these, sometimes prefer, especially the government, to prefer to give large sums of money, partly because it's just easier. It's less burden for them. And then they can be subcontracted and split among different organizations. Sometimes it's purely for that reason. But the other reason is more tactical. And I think a lot of funders do understand that projects and programs that have a larger amount of community buy-in, that are more collaborative, are more likely to be successful and sustainable in the long run. So there is kind of a strategy to piece to these large collaborative funding opportunities as well. I wanted to share an example that's come up in some of this research and talking to CAC, which is about the SERF, or the Community Economic Resilience Fund, also known as Jobs First. This was put together by 3 different state agencies, and the first phase was that a large amount of money went out to different regional collaboratives, and those were very collaborative processes where there was workshops and they had rounds of writing different drafts, and then the drafts were open for comments. Some of you may have been part of that process. And the output was to create these regional summaries, which I heard were finalized in December, and then regional plans, which I think in most places are in kind of a comment phase right now. And these regional plans include strategies for job creation with the right amount of participation from your field, from community composting, could include strategies of including community composting as one of the strategies, one of the strategies in the plans. And then there'll be funds set out for funding these projects later. Many of the funds that are coming out for Jobs First are big, giant implementation grants that probably won't be applicable. And the Catalyst funds are probably going to be quite big for a lot of, or will be too big for most of you individually. But what I put out is there is this pot of Catalyst money that went to the regional organizations in March and is now going to be sub-granted. And there's sort of a sweet spot in that there's smaller amounts of money, there's a lot of planning involved, and depending what strategies are in the regional plans, some of that might go into this industry, into the community composting space. CAC has been participating in the workshop and drafting strategies for several regions. How small? So here's what I have to land on the last point about this. Each region, so that got these planning grants, basically have their own entities right now. Some of them were entities to begin with, and some of them formed over these collaborative grants. Like I discussed before, I formed a brand new team with my collaborators. These collaboratives are now the holders of these Catalyst funds and are designing the processes for their own individual region to regrant the funds based on the plans. So they are drafting RFPs. A lot of them are open for comment right now just to get project ideas. They have forms. I will share a research with you that I've compiled to the best of my ability. It has all of the different regions. Who is that collaborative? Who is the grantor? If there's a draft plan out, I put a link to the plan. And if they have an application out, as well as a request for comment, I put those links in there too. But what I really wanted to kind of convey with this slide was the importance of participating and learning about what's happening in your region. You can join their listserv, you can comment if you haven't already. You can also talk to Courtney and CAC and find out more about some of the comments and guidance that they've been giving. I know there's sort of this, for example, one of the general wording in these has to do with industrial composters, large scale composters. And there's a push from a lot of different community members and collaborators to make that wording not just say industrial, because that really limits community composters from being available to this. Let me see if there's anything else. Yeah, Courtney basically says if you're interested in joining, you're seeing the chat, to please get involved with that. But this is just an example of this big collaborative project that was announced really a couple of years ago. We knew the Catalyst funds would be coming, and some organizations have been really sort of doing the groundwork for a while on that. And I don't want you to feel bad if you're small and haven't been super involved, because it's still probably a ways out for you getting a direct Catalyst grant yourself. But this is how these collaboratives grow, and you can position yourself from when more opportunities come around to be part of these discussions and hopefully part of some of these bigger collaborative grants. I did not put the link to the document that I made in this yet, but I will add the link before I share the slides out, and it is in my notes. But it is, like I said, it's a Google Doc. And if I did it right, I even listed your organization in the region that you're in so that you can figure out who your contact is if you want to know more about what's happening in your region with the Catalyst funds. Okay, move on to budgets. Everyone's favorite. It actually is one of my favorites, but I think, I don't know. Budgets are budgets. They are just one of the things you have to include. So one of the first things that you really are going to have to keep in mind is, how are you going to estimate the cost of your project? What are the different inputs? Some of you may already have a pretty set system of bookkeeping at hand, and that's great. That will give you some actuals on how much things cost. And if not, it's definitely the time to continue to keep track of everything. I even would say keep track of hours, even if you're volunteering, because that can be used to create an equivalent to try to understand how much time could cost to, how much things could cost. So here, I am going to send you the link to the, I want to give you the link to the Catalyst grants. I'll do that in the chat in just a moment. So when you're estimating labor, a lot of funders, not all of them, work using the FTEs, or the full-time equivalent. A full-time equivalent is basically a full-time employee, and it's a unit of measurement to figure out full-time employees. Usually this is considering a full-time employee to be someone who works 40 hours. So one FTE is one full-time employee. 0.5 FTE would be a half-time employee. Or sometimes you're piecing together. Maybe you have 3 people that are each working 10 hours a week. And so you add up what percentage of an FTE you need to fund that person. So 3 people working 10 hours a week, that's 30 out of 40 hours a week. That's maybe a 0.75 FTE. And Courtney's giving you the numbers in hours per year. Before I go on, I'm going to show you an example. Sometimes they don't use the word FTE, but you're putting into percentage. So this was a grant where you could ask for up to $50,000. It was for an school garden education program. And the way we wrote the grant was that it would cover 40% of the education manager's time. And then we would allocate 10% to our farm manager and 5% for more administration for the program director. But the budget in this case was not they didn't want like a really detailed Excel, I mean, it is an Excel sheet, but it was a form that they gave us to fill out. and they didn't want a lot of detail. They didn't want a lot of numbers. They just want to know what the program is for, what it's referring to, and then the amount. So I just showed you this as an example to think about estimating your costs. And of course, depending on what the funder is available, how much money is available, this gets kind of tricky. You're sometimes kind of trying to squeeze it in. But on your end, it's important to really think about what your needs and costs are. How much really would it cost to pay all of the labor that you need to run your operation? How many quote unquote FTEs? What are the salaries? So yeah, it's an exercise in doing both. Sometimes you want to include, well, ideally you include benefits in your cost of labor. I know that when you're a really tiny startup, that sounds really impossible, but benefits can sometimes be done as a percentage or a percentage of the salary, or maybe you do have more exact costs because you are paying insurance or do have healthcare stipends. But those are all things to consider in your labor costs. When it comes to estimating the cost of supplies and equipment, the best thing to do is to look at actuals and then to get quotes, especially for bigger purchases. Funders want to see that they know where you got your money, when you got the amount from, if you're going to purchase, even when we purchased the yard waste bins, right? We got a quote from a vendor and we submitted that with our application. Supplies could also be things like, I don't know, worms. I'm trying to think of different supplies for composting, garden tools, shovels. These are all things that are usually, again, depending on the grant, sometimes big equipment like trucks and buildings are not allowed, but that doesn't mean you can't buy smaller things like garden tools or building supplies. Other things to consider for budget would be mileage, potentially other kind of administration costs. I mentioned before that if the grant has a lot of reporting requirements, do you need to think about contracting or just additional labor for that? Any other consultants or community partners? I've been part of a lot of grants where, especially when I worked at a city agency, where we really wanted to funnel more money into the community, but with partners that weren't always grant ready. And so we worked with them as consultants or contractors, or well, essentially as contractors, but it was money to go directly to the community partners doing the work. And anyway, just thinking about where, if you're going to be more of the lead on a project, if you're going to be sharing the money with other organizations to do part of the work, to do part of the education. I'm not sure. The most important thing is that the budget should match with the work plan. The example I gave before is that we're expanding compost. We need the truck, we need the bins, and then we need to make sure we have enough labor to actually do the full composting route and pick up as much compost as we said we're going to. That's basically to make sure. I mean, this is the telling the funder, this is what you're getting with your money. They're seeing it through the work plan, and then they're seeing it through the budget. So those two need to work together. Some funders will give you a budget template, and I'd say use it, especially if it's simple. And also just, I really like the funders that just that say, we don't care about each individual line item. We just kind of want buckets and we trust you. There are community foundations that do that, and some that are going to be a little bit more sticklers. I usually work with assumption tabs, and I'll show you that in just a minute, but I usually make different scenarios and try out different, I use different assumptions to figure out the costs of things. And I'm just checking out some comments that are helpful from Courtney here, that workers' compensation is dependent on the job type code. Some are more expensive. So it's important to correctly categorize each job. Thank you. She also defined fringe benefits, which is paid time off, paid sick leave, paid holidays, retirement savings, program commuter benefits, medical benefits, etc. Thank you. Yeah, these have always been really tough when I'm working with really small organizations where people aren't getting paid themselves. We've always had to spend quite a bit of time to figure out um, how to work these in, but especially larger funders that are looking to, well, actually, what I was going to say is when it comes to thinking about your wages and benefits, especially the funders that want to provide labor and living wage. And there's an argument to be made that yes, you ask for the higher amount, you ask for what you need because you are also taking care of your staff. I think there's a bit of an older, I think I meant to mention this in the other part and I don't really know what happened, but in the past, funders were a little bit more wary to fund these indirect cost, administration cost, overhead, as they would call it. But I think, or even just paying more people than they are to like direct programs. But I think that that's changed a lot. I think it's really important for a lot of funders. They want to see that the staff is compensated fairly, that they are getting their benefits. And so as you make your model, really, at least when you're applying for these bigger grants, think about what would be the best case scenario. When it comes to calculating wages, I think Jimena gave some examples before. I included a living wage calculator to consider and also think about program comps, or excuse me, comparable, like different comparables of different organizations and programs in your area, how much others in that industry are getting paid to figure out for coming up for your wages. And then just as an interesting reference that I heard the other day, I think that the Jobs First they consider a full-time job creation to be a job that's paid $64,000. And so there are, I don't know, you can use resources like that to kind of quantify how you're thinking about budgeting wages. Anyway, that's a lot. Any questions before I show you another budget example? Okay, I thought I would jump in and show you kind of like the work in progress behind the scenes of how I thought about making a budget for this blog post grant. So let's hope my screen sharing does what it's supposed to. So this is what I mean by assumptions. Assumptions is a tab that before you actually build out your budget line by line, you put in how much everything costs. And sometimes I link this directly to the budget, sometimes not, but it's helpful for your funder to see if they're able, well, depending on what you're allowed to submit. It's just good to know where you're getting these costs from. It also means you can play around with different scenarios. Maybe you wanted a truck that costs $33,000, but maybe there's a version where a truck that costs more or less. When it came to staff, we played with, so the unit of cost is the actual amount per month for the salary. And we use percentages for unemployment insurance, workman's comp, and included even a cost of living increase each year. And then the scenario here was how much of the grant is going to cover that person. We then did a scenario where we basically, this funder said, if you want to submit 2 budget scenarios, you can, sort of a higher end and a lower end. And we did, and they funded the lower one. And I want to say that I think it's probably, if they request that you can do different scenarios, that's probably a good thing. I obviously wish that they'd funded the higher end, but I think it showed that you're really thinking through things, and it was probably a good thing to submit the 2 scenarios. But basically, whereas the first version, we asked for the owner salary to be 50%, We then, in the second scenario, said that the owner would get 25% of her salary covered by the grant, and what we consider to be a match, so as WAMPOS would make up the rest of that funding from other sources. And so we wrote these out in different boxes. I know it's a little bit confusing to see. So this was our match scenario. So this was our side of the equation. And then this was the scenario for the funder that had a little bit lower numbers. And then that went into what ended up being, and this was kind of the format that they used. So it's kind of simple, but they wanted to know the cost of wages and benefits total, and they wanted to know how much we would put in. And then the cost of equipment, the cost of mileage, the cost of contracted services broken down. We had money for scholarships, so we basically had money to pay for customers that couldn't pay, and then for our annual event marketing. And we submitted these two scenarios. One would cost our funder $160,000, and the other one would cost our funder $220,000. We also submitted a narrative of these scenarios, which I'll show you on a slide in just a minute. And yeah, that was the way we put this one together. I also included in this document, and this is sort of a planning piece, the description of what is allowed to be funded in this grant. So we were constantly checking back to make sure. So this funder, personnel working directly on the grant, including fringe benefits such as health insurance, retirement funds, FICA, etc. They allowed for supplies. This is a fund. This is a state fund specifically for waste diversion. So they even, it was very specific. Composting bags, recycling cards were very obviously included in this. They also knew that people might be buying things like vehicles or vehicles. And they also allowed for travel costs. And then they tell you about indirect and direct costs, what's allowed. So I like to keep all of this together. And yeah, that's how we put this budget together. Any questions? Of course, we'll do time for more general questions at the end, but if there's something you can't see well or want to. See, anything else I was gonna say about budget? Showed you this. Okay. The last slide is the way we did the narrative. So some funders want a narrative, which is kind of as it sounds, it's a narrative of what things are funding. Instead of just a line item, you're explaining exactly what this comes from. So the things I have highlighted here are really the differences between the two scenarios. So in one scenario, we requested 40% the cost of workman's comp, and the other ones that wasn't included, or excuse me, workman's comp, unemployment insurance, and health insurance. And in the other scenario, we were only requesting 25% of her salary and 25% of the compost driver salary. So it was less. Some of the categories we kept the same because they were sort of, the equipment was the main driver for her to get this grant, was so she could get the yard waste bins and the truck and the cart chipper. And so we kept those in, but we just tweaked the different scenarios of how much of her labor would be covered by this grant. Of course, this is a bit of a different example. She is an LLC. This is a for-cost business. She does use grants sometimes as well as donations, but she also does make money. But there are less grant opportunities for LLCs, but they do exist, especially when there are some kind of social benefits such as composting. And here we were only able to fund 30 low-income customers versus the 100 in our other scenario. So that's a budget narrative. And yeah, I think this is the last slide, but that's okay because that'll give us about 30 minutes or so. Really, the last thing that I'm sort of asked to include in this, and I think is really important, is the application submission process. I don't have a lot to say about this other than it's really important to use your time management. As you can see from the rest of the entire presentation, is that there's a million details to this. And I also want to refer back to what Jimena had told you, is it's not going to be linear. It's going to look very linear when you submit everything. It's going to have each question, each portion, each attachment, but you are going to work on it in the way that you can. You're going to work on the work plan. Maybe you're going to be building a budget at the same time. You're maybe going to write a question based on some boilerplate. You might have to talk to some partners to fill out a question all about community collaboration. But ultimately, that just makes it even more important that you are managing your time. You're setting deadlines and internal deadlines to edit, again, to meet with the partners that you need to meet with. And I always try to set myself an internal deadline to do the actual submission early, at least a day early, if not more. I mean, usually, realistically, it's just a day, but in case there's any technical difficulties, something doesn't attach, computer, there's inevitably something goes wrong. And so note the deadline and the time of day and put on your calendar before that to go ahead and do the submission. Edit, triple check everything, and start building that folder of boilerplate text, of attachments, of your IRS letter, of your partners of support, your letters of support from your partners, of your key staff. What else have we talked about? Yeah, any other attachments that you're gonna just kind of keep that you can use for lots of grants. Start building that folder out. And yeah, good luck. You can do it. I think that's kind of all I have for the, let's see, for the main thing. So let me go and see. Yeah, the scenarios that I provided was what the funder wanted. And like I said, if the funder gives you a format, that's very helpful, honestly. I can share some. I thought about this. I wasn't sure what to say. I think Jimena gave you a decent budget template, and I can certainly share some, but they do depend a bit on the funder. So, actually no, the slide I made for Wampost, the only one that the funder gave me was the actual budget one, like was the. I'll show you. Wait, no, I don't have to stop sharing to do that. I'm so sorry. This is all in the same tab now. I think that the only thing that the budget that the funder gave me was this. No, not even that. This was the categories as well as this. This is the form that they wanted you to use. But I built the rest of it because I wanted to see the different, kind of try different scenarios out.
Right, we have another question from Justine.
Yes.
What is the best way to win a first grant? Meaning, how does a small organization beat out more established ones to win grant funding?
Yeah. I think I think it's really about setting yourself apart in terms of what kind of value you offer as an organization, in terms of what you do, how you're positioned in your community, who your team is. are some of the ways to beat them out, There are organizations that want to fund small new projects as well. Sometimes it's also finding the right funding source that's really designed for those. And I do welcome if anyone else has any answers to that question as well. Paula asked a question about budget, calculating the site manager salary. And Courtney, oh yeah. The CAC uses a base wage to pay site operators of $25 an hour across the state. And that costs a contracting entity on average, which would be $28.16 an hour in total costs. Which includes which includes
Yeah, so this
workers' comp taxes. Yeah.
one's a bit confusing because we don't pay site operators directly. We're in business to business agreements with all of you, and you pay your own staff. So we wanted to make sure that the site operators had a living wage of $25 an hour. And in order to be able to fully support the site groups to offer that living wage job, we need to pay the site groups a little bit more to help cover their overhead of what it actually costs them for every hour that you work. So that includes not just your base wage, but it's going to include what the employer pays for their FICA, their unemployment insurance, and their ETT taxes, what they pay for workers' comp, depending on how they categorized your job. So that can either be pretty cheap if you're an office administrative employee, or if you're on-site operational working with tools and heavy equipment, can be very expensive. So that's why I said on average of what it costs an entity. So, and then also the overhead of general liability insurance, which is an annual cost, and you would, divide that down again into, if that supports 5 employees all working 2,080 hours a year, then you can figure out what the cost per hour for 5 employees is of that insurance cost and divide that out accordingly. But basically the idea is that we pay the business to business entity a little bit more than what they're going to pay as the base wage to their staff member, so we can help them cover their capacity to actually give that job. So when you are building your own budgets and you're one and the same, you are the business entity and you are the employer, you can't just think about a $25 hour job and the salary of what that adds up into an annual salary amount. You have to consider all the extra costs per hour to offer that base wage to the employee. One thing I didn't mention in here, which is actually a very expensive portion of this, is sick leave accrual. So this is California state law. Paid time off, paid holidays, all those other fringe benefits, those are extra. They're defined by full-time or status of the employee, or how many employees the business has itself, whether or not you're required by law to also offer those benefits. Medical benefits can also start adding up. So I would say the cost of a $25 an hour job for a full-time employee who gets paid time off, sick leave, medical benefit stipend, and has a workers' compensation charge of a site operator, not as an office employee, that can get as expensive as $31 an hour to pay a base wage of $25 an hour to that person. So you would be calculating the budget for their salary, if it's a full-time job at 2,080 hours a year, at the $31 hour rate, the higher rate, because that's your total cost rate. It includes base wage plus everything else the employer has to pay just to offer that hour of a job.
I can quickly try to address the question from Jen Sistine about paying grant writers. The short answer is not really. Only that a lot of funders it depends on how much indirect or fundraising or administration you're allowed to ask for. The way that I've done it in the past, which is still not, is grant administration is a type of administration, so the reporting. And sometimes if I'm being really honest, some organizations have sort of estimated my cost to be higher to help pay for that in the administration part. I don't know if Courtney has any other suggestions for that, but
Yeah,
and we are pretty, yeah,
this is a really good lead into the quick answer from my perspective and my experience is no. The costs of
yeah,
writing the grant usually cannot be covered by the grant itself because they're really specific on when funding starts. And any
yeah,
costs associated with what you're doing in your program that occurred before that notice to proceed date are not eligible either to be reimbursed or the funds that they disperse to you to pay yourself back with. So be really careful on that. So with that, I encourage you to take all of these little bits of nonlinear process and start setting some action items for yourself to use these next 8 months to build out certain portions that would be in any grant application that could be coming up in the future. So your program narratives, your program budgets, your staff and roles, your mission, your objectives and goals, and also the very specific activities that will bring about that impact, which is your theory of change. Take the time now to write about it and to practice, even if you don't have a specific audience, and then take the resources we're offering you with Lindsay and Jimena to get some real professional eyes on that. So when the time comes in the future, you can go really fast because you've spent this moment to have it be more of a relaxed and creative process. And I wanted to give a huge round of applause to Lindsay. Just thank you so much for joining us today and walking through what can be, a real big learning curve for folks. And we really do hope that this was useful to all of you that have been watching. And again, we will post this on our YouTube channel. We will provide you with the slides, with the chat, with the whiteboard, and with pages of additional resources and links that you can dive into your rabbit hole with.
thank you so much. I will look forward to meeting you all more. Take care, everyone.